During the last glacial maximum, Cro-Magnon hunter-gatherer bands migrated to Eurasia, competed and contested with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and drove them into extinction with only limited intermarriage between the three groups. In the millennia after this, as the glacial maximum ended, the Cro-Magnons of Eurasia developed into their distinct Paleolithic cultures, such as the Western European and Eastern European hunter-gatherer traditions. In particularly food-rich areas, some hunter-gatherers eventually began settling into tribes of a few dozen to a few hundred people each. In addition to following the traditional practices of the Cro-Magnon peoples, they constructed semi-permanent huts out of stone, wood, and reeds, and lived in villages that lasted for decades at a time. They gathered a wide variety of plant species and fish from the swamplands and fertile river valleys. They had domesticated dogs, and used cooperative pack hunting skills to take down large prey species such as mammoths, woolly rhinos, saber cats, bears, and elk, using spears, atlatls, and bows and arrows, until these large prey species were virtually exterminated from the continent. This Mesolithic hunter-gatherer culture was most prominent in the Balkan Peninsula, and is known to archaeologists and anthropologists as the Iron Gates culture, after the Iron Gates region of the Danube River Valley, where many of these artifacts and tools from this culture were found. For 5,000 years since the glacial maximum ended, this remained the dominant way of life in Europe. There are no known European peoples who natively discovered agriculture. It wouldn't arrive until about 7,000 BC, when organized Neolithic farming colonies were established, such as Kirakita on the Isle of Cyprus and Knossos on the Isle of Crete. These farming communities, considered the oldest in Europe, were settled by seafaring peoples from the aggressive and expansionist High Chiefdom of Byblos, who in the same period also settled colonies in southern Anatolia, such as Yamuk-Tepe, Çatalhöyük, and Hakalar. After several centuries of land invasions and expansions, Byblos was reaching the height of their power and authority, and sponsored colonial expeditions using their cedar longboats along with astronomical star charts which had been developing for centuries. They settled numerous colonies along the northeastern Mediterranean as they massacred the local populations through a combination of warfare and livestock diseases. Nevertheless, it took decades for the Byblos colonists to defeat the local inhabitants, and to firmly establish plantations within the newly discovered land they were stealing. And they supplemented their diets with fish which could be found in great abundance, as well as some limited hunting and gathering, although this had become a specialized occupation practiced by a relatively small percentage of Neolithic villagers. Over the course of the early 6000s BC, these colonies spread throughout the Aegean Islands, as well as the mainland coast of Greece, the largest colony of the time being Sesklo at about 1,000 people. They constructed wattle and daub huts and built wooden forts with reinforced palisades. They tended cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, and they planted farms growing emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. The Neolithic package crops originally descended from crops in the Levantine homeland, sending tributes and taxes back to Byblos. In addition, they began experiments to domesticate a new cereal crop, oats, which grew significantly better in the European climate than the imported wheat crops. They require less heat in the summer and have a greater tolerance to heavy rains. They built mining operations to acquire salt and malachite copper ore, which were circulated around the chiefdom in great abundance, and they also quarried precious stones like obsidian, jadeite, and diorite, for use in making jewelry and religious figurines which were reminiscent of the old Paleolithic Venus figurines and the like. They seem to have worshipped a mother goddess, as there are numerous depictions of such a goddess from both Greece and Anatolia. They established religious cults around her, and she was the forerunner of later Bronze Age mother goddess cults employing hallucinogenic mushrooms, such as that of the Mycenaean Thea, the Minoan Rhea, and the Anatolian Cybele. It's safe to say that by 6500 BC, the Byblos High Chiefdom had achieved a great level of colonial success, arrogantly believing themselves to be a culturally superior race to all other peoples on Earth. It was this belief system that led to them exerting de facto control and dominance over much of the existing farmland in the West for hundreds of years. Leaving lakes of human blood behind them, they spread their cultural traditions to a large swath of territory on both land and sea, and over time they increased their colonial populations until they had reached a point where they could function almost autonomously, leading to expeditions and occupations of even more hunter-gatherer territory further inland. They established hill fort settlements in Thessaly, Euboea, Macedonia, and the Peloponnese, using many bows, javelins, clubs, and axes to slaughter the inhabitants and drive any survivors into less and less desirable living areas. Many of the native survivors died from starvation as well as from viruses introduced to Greece by foreign animals, diseases which they had not developed resistance to. In the later 6000s BC, the High Chiefdom reached the western shores of Greece, settling the Neolithic towns of Epirus and Corfu. Between about 6200 and 6000 BC, the planet underwent a drastic cooling that had a major impact on human activities worldwide. Crops failed, prey animals and livestock died in great numbers, and famines swept the land. The agricultural communities were disrupted the most significantly, because their peoples had tremendous difficulty transitioning back to a hunter-gatherer way of life. But hunter-gatherers themselves suffered greatly as well. It was impossible for many groups to recover from it. The Byblos chiefdom, for example, suffered a series of tremendous upheavals, severely compromising their military's ability to maintain order. Many Neolithic sites in Greece were reduced to just a few dozen people. The Cyprus colony and a few others were wiped out entirely. Long-distance trade ground to a halt, and many people in the chiefly homeland died as they could not feed themselves, their own soils having been long dilapidated by misuse. They did not practice crop rotation. The capital lost contact with much of the territory they had gained in the preceding centuries, and wasn't able to regain it, with very few remaining holdings outside of modern-day Lebanon. The Byblos High Chiefdom effectively ends here. If they had had a more complex society, they might be considered humanity's first empire. When Byblos fell, those vast swaths of territory which they had previously held sovereignty over scrambled to take control of whatever they could. A smaller, independent chiefdom survived in Lebanon for a few more millennia, since their cedar hinterlands were difficult to successfully invade from the outside. In Syria, Abu Huraira and Aswad were abandoned, and after a brief period of chaos, new seats of power gradually became established, such as Halaf, as well as Hassuna and Samarra in northern Iraq. Even communities in eastern Turkey, which were thousands of years old, such as Kayanu, had to be abandoned after centuries of decline and foreign occupation, with their people migrating to new towns being established to the west and south. In Canaan, sites like Jericho and Ein Ghazal were severely hit by the climactic change, but they survived as entities and continued to fight for dominance of the local region. They continued the traditions handed down to them in a period which has been termed the Pre-Pottery Neolithic Sea. There was considerable migration southward, which resulted in the widespread adoption of nomadic sheep herding and goat herding in the Negev, the Sinai, and along the northern coasts of the Red Sea, all of which were considerably more fertile in those days than they are now. The Nile Delta also acquired agriculture and domestic animals around this time. Spreading from the pre-Pottery Neolithic Sea area, populations grew and stabilized, and the pre-Pottery Neolithic Sea evolved into the Yarmouktian, Lodian, and Nizanim cultural traditions in Canaan. It also had a considerable influence on the development of the Fayum culture in Lower Egypt, and by extension other African Neolithic cultures. In Anatolia, sites like Çatalhöyük were tremendously crippled from the climactic change, with its famous eastern mound settlement having to be abandoned as a result. Its people returned generations later, however, rebuilding the town on the site's western mound. After that, they appear to have succeeded in conquering their immediate neighbors, and by 6000 BC, they built a chiefdom of their own, controlling the south-central part of the peninsula, beginning a series of conflicts westward. On the western shores of Anatolia, former Byblos colonies such as Uluca-Koyuk and Fikirtepe fought one another until one came to dominate the local area, called Ilipinar. Like Çatalhöyük, Ilipinar's population size and carbon footprint were far greater than that of other towns in the local region, and the major pottery cultures which developed in Anatolia around this time appear to have radiated from these two large sites, Çatalhöyük and Ilipinar. Dark burnished ware using mineral and grit tempers had been implemented into the wider region during the Byblos expansion of the early 6000s BC. Although by the time of the 8.2 kiloyear event there seems to have been widespread experiments in developing a new pottery style using thicker sides with handles and tempered using some kind of vegetable solvent. They began painting their pottery after firing it in their kilns, pressing designs into it beforehand, primarily using brown, cream, or red paint pigments. The form and function of pots increased in diversity, some with beaked necks or fat bottoms. This new painted pottery was primarily used in food storage or for libation rituals, while dark burnished ware vessels were primarily utilized as cooking pots. The demand for pottery became higher, and its production became a specialized class of Anatolian society. They maintained many technological advances of their ancestors, including neighborhoods of rectangular houses constructed from wattle and daub, and lime flooring produced using kilns. They also maintained the crops and livestock raised by their ancestors: emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, peas and chickpeas, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. On the mainland coasts of Greece, surviving towns and villages fought one another for supremacy in the wake of the 8.2 kiloyear event, until one came to power and influence called Sesklo, which conquered the other sites over the course of the next few centuries and created a chiefdom which took tribute from other nearby towns and villages. While most Neolithic sites in Greece enjoyed domesticated grains and pulses, as well as pigs, sheep, and goats, their cattle was largely restricted to the Sesklo area through the rigorous imposition of tributes. This gave Sesklo access to all these foods, and they have the largest concentration of cattle bones for the time in the entire region, a trait they share with large sites in Anatolia such as Çatalhöyük and Ilipinar. Sesklo also had the highest population of any Neolithic Greek site, about 4,000 people, comparable to Ilipinar and just shy of Çatalhöyük's population of 5,000. Most Neolithic sites at this time were a tenth of that, and most Mesolithic sites were even smaller. Sesklo developed a unique pottery style of their own, creating pots with a wide variety of forms and functions and using brown or red paint to design geometric motifs on them. This pottery style spread throughout the Sesklo area, although impressed cardial ware remained prominent in Epirus and Corfu, indicating they were outside of Sesklo's sphere of influence. Finally, peoples living in the Aegean Sea maintained a mixed cultural style, as they lived between three chiefdoms with relatively high spheres of influence. Neolithic townships had diffused throughout the Aegean centuries prior, settling in places like Samos and Ikaria, and then further across the islands known as the Cyclades, such as Naxos, Paros, Andros, Kithnos, Milos, and Delos, not to mention Santorini. The island of Milos in particular was famous at the time for its obsidian mining and tool-making industry. Many tools and artifacts made from Milos obsidian appear in the Sesklo, Ilipinar, and Çatalhöyük chiefdoms, indicating either widespread trade across the Aegean and/or bloody and repetitive resource wars between the three cultures. At this time their populations grew and expanded, and by 5500 BC, they had begun conquering the Iron Gates culture through force of arms and massacring the local populations, establishing new farmsteads there protected by hill fort settlements. In general, the lands which had been conquered by Byblos and the colonies seated by them remained very Byblos-like in their social, economic, and political values even after the high chiefdom fell from power. However, their material cultures developed and changed with each successive generation as they adapted to their local environmental pressures, and in turn sent out new colonies further from the original parent chiefdom in terms of both physical distance and time.